At Preston Corporation, Linda stands out as the most dedicated and capable employee in the entire office. Her supervisor, Donovan, reviews her latest report and is clearly impressed, openly complimenting her attention to detail and sharp analytical skills. Despite that, when it's time for the board meeting, he refuses to let her attend, assuring her that he'll make sure everyone knows the work is hers. But the moment the meeting begins, Donovan quietly removes her name and presents the report as his own, taking full credit without hesitation. Later, Linda attempts to vent her frustration to a colleague, but her awkward delivery only makes things more uncomfortable, leaving her feeling even more isolated. When a group of coworkers starts planning a social outing, she tries to join in, hoping to connect with them, but once again she's subtly excluded, reinforcing the sense that she doesn't belong. Back at home, her loneliness becomes even more apparent. She has no close friends or family around. Her vacation photos show her traveling alone, and her only companion is a talkative parrot. Still, Linda clings to her optimism. She genuinely believes that if she keeps working hard, things will eventually fall into place. After all, the company's owner once hinted that she was next in line for a vice president role. In the evenings, she unwinds by watching episodes of Survivor, clearly fascinated by themes of endurance and resilience. Her bookshelf and travel memories reflect that same interest in survival and self-reliance. The following day brings a major change. Bradley steps in as the new company president, taking over after his father's passing. Eager to make a good impression, Linda hurriedly hides her lunch and rushes over to introduce herself. Unfortunately, she still has a smear of mayonnaise on her face, which immediately puts Bradley off. Trying to recover, she cracks a joke about his shoes, but it only makes things more awkward, prompting him to quickly excuse himself. Once in his office, Bradley notices the mayo on his hand and reacts with disgust, complaining about how unpleasant Linda is. Executive Franklin steps in, reminding him that Linda had been promised the vice president position. But Bradley dismisses the idea outright, stating he intends to give the promotion to Donovan instead. Franklin pushes back, emphasizing that the company heavily relies on Linda's work, so much so that Bradley's own father entrusted her with critical responsibilities. Bradley, however, doesn't care. He suggests moving her to a different office entirely, just to keep her out of sight. Franklin, growing concerned, reminds him about an upcoming high-stakes meeting in Bangkok. Donovan won't be able to handle it alone, especially since no one has been able to resolve the issue tied to Appendix D. Reluctantly, Bradley agrees to bring Linda along, but only to assist Donovan behind the scenes. She won't be included in any official meetings. Later on, Linda accidentally witnesses Bradley and Donovan behaving a bit too casually with each other. A coworker fills her in, explaining that the two go way back as fraternity friends, and that Donovan has just been promoted to vice president. Furious, Linda storms into Bradley's office demanding an explanation. She points out the obvious. Donovan has only been with the company for 6 months, while she's dedicated 7 years of her life to it. Bradley responds bluntly. He acknowledges that Linda is excellent with numbers, but insists she lacks the people skills needed to close deals and influence others. To make matters worse, he casually points out that she has something stuck in her teeth, humiliating her even further. As a compromise, he tells her that if she joins the Bangkok trip and successfully solves the Appendix D issue, she might prove him wrong. Linda tries to argue, but Bradley has already tuned her out, more interested in heading off to play golf. Just then, his fiancée Zuri arrives, catching Linda's attention with an eye-catching, expensive ring. As Linda prepares to leave, Bradley adds one more insult, claiming that coworkers have complained about her eating lunch at her desk because of the smell, so she'll need to start using the break room. In reality, he's the only one bothered. Holding back tears, Linda walks through the office, painfully aware of the eyes she imagines watching her. She finally makes it to her car, where she breaks down, trying to reassure herself that she's enough, even as the tears keep falling. On the morning of the trip, Linda shows up at the airport energized and hopeful, announcing that she's already figured out a solution for Appendix D. But Bradley barely acknowledges her. During the flight, Linda continues working diligently while Bradley and the others joke around. At one point, Donovan reveals he's found Linda's old audition tape for Survivor, and the group bursts into laughter at her expense. Realizing she's being mocked, Linda is deeply hurt, and in that moment, she decides not to send her completed report. Suddenly, the plane jolts violently. A flight attendant instructs everyone to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. Linda and Bradley comply immediately, but Bradley mocks the precaution, joking that only weak people need seatbelts. The others laugh along, ignoring the warning. Moments later, the turbulence intensifies. Donovan and two other employees are thrown across the cabin as chaos erupts. Then, without warning, a fire breaks out and the plane begins to descend rapidly. A section of the fuselage tears open, causing a sudden loss of cabin pressure. One employee is instantly pulled out into the sky. Donovan clings desperately to Linda's leg, and she reaches out to help him, offering her arm. Instead of taking it, he demands her seat. Nearby, another man grabs onto Bradley, who coldly shoves him away. The man manages to latch onto Donovan's leg, and as Linda's glasses are knocked off, they strike him in the face. Desperate and panicked, he refuses to let go. Donovan, shouting at him to release his grip, is met with resistance. The man even bites his leg in desperation. Donovan reacts by striking him. Then, in a shocking turn, Donovan grabs Linda by the throat, again demanding her seat. Acting on instinct, Linda grabs a fork and drives it into his hand. The pain forces him to let go, and both men are pulled out through the opening. Donovan's tie gets caught, leaving his body slamming violently against the aircraft's exterior. As he pleads for help, Linda makes a chilling decision. She shuts the window. With one engine gone, the aircraft slams down onto the ocean's surface. The impact is brutal, and within seconds, seawater begins pouring into the cabin. Linda instinctively holds her breath, fumbling with her seatbelt as the rising water threatens to trap her. After a tense struggle, she finally frees herself and pushes forward, only to come face to face with the lifeless body of the flight attendant drifting in the water. The shock makes her gasp, but she forces herself to keep moving, kicking her way out of the wreckage and up toward the surface. When she finally breaks through, gasping for air, she realizes there's nothing around her, no land, no help, just endless ocean. Moments later, the remains of the plane vanish beneath the waves, leaving her completely alone. By morning, Linda regains consciousness on a small, isolated island. Disoriented but alive, she stumbles through the unfamiliar terrain until she discovers Bradley lying nearby. He's unconscious, his leg badly injured with a deep gash. Without hesitation, Linda gets to work. She smashes one rock against another until she creates a sharp edge, using it as a makeshift blade to cut through plants. With vines and branches, she constructs a basic shelter. She even digs a small pit, placing coconut shells inside to collect rainwater. As evening falls, rain begins to pour, but her shelter holds up, keeping her dry as she tends to Bradley. The next day, Linda drinks from the coconut water she collected. Around that same time, Bradley finally regains consciousness. She carefully helps him sit up and gives him some water. When he learns that no one else survived, he breaks down briefly, overwhelmed by the reality, before thanking her for saving him. From there, Linda continues working tirelessly. Using dry branches and leaves, she manages to start a fire. She even catches a fish and cooks it over the flames. When she offers some to Bradley, he turns his nose up at it, complaining about the smell. Frustrated, Linda doesn't take no for an answer. She practically forces him to eat, knowing he needs the strength. The following morning, Linda excitedly shows him a conch shell she's found, clearly thrilled by the discovery. Bradley, however, is in no mood to celebrate. He demands to know why she hasn't tried to signal for rescue or search the plane for GPS equipment. Linda explains that her focus has been on keeping them alive, but Bradley insists survival isn't enough. They need to get off the island. When he tries to stand, pain shoots through his injured leg, and he collapses. Linda moves to help, but he recoils, refusing her assistance. She jokes about how soft his hands are, which only irritates him further. He snaps, reminding her that she should show him respect because he's still her boss. That's the breaking point. Fed up, Linda grabs her things and walks off, leaving him to deal with the situation on his own. As the hours drag on, Bradley tries to convince himself he doesn't need her, but hunger and thirst quickly set in, and it becomes painfully clear he can't manage by himself. That night, strong winds tear apart his poorly built shelter. By the next day, the sun beats down mercilessly, burning his skin until he eventually collapses. When Linda returns, she brings water and bluntly tells him that the rules of the office no longer apply out here. Realizing he has no choice, Bradley finally accepts her help. Not long after, he's eating again, humbled by the situation. Linda mentions she spotted tracks, possibly from a wild boar, and decides to hunt it. She crafts a spear, preparing for the challenge. Bradley scoffs, doubting that someone from accounting could handle something like that. Linda immediately corrects him. She's from strategy and planning, not accounting, and calls him out for pretending to know her work when he clearly never bothered to look at it. In the dense forest, Linda carefully follows the tracks, staying alert. Suddenly, a noise stops her in her tracks. Before she can react, a boar charges from behind, knocking her to the ground. She scrambles away just as the animal gets briefly stuck behind a fallen tree, giving her a narrow window to escape. But the boar isn't giving up. It circles around, tracking her down until it finds her discarded jacket. At that moment, Linda strikes, leaping down from above and driving her spear into its neck. The weapon snaps under the force, and the wounded animal thrashes wildly, trying to throw her off. When it charges again, she uses the broken half of the spear to stab it once more. Still, it refuses to go down, spraying blood and mucus as it struggles. Desperate, Linda yanks the remaining piece from its neck and repeatedly drives it into the animal's eye until it finally collapses. Not long after, she drags the boar's head back to camp and drops it in front of Bradley with a sense of pride, casually declaring that she enjoys hunting. That night, they both feast on the meat, something far better than anything Bradley expected to eat on the island. A few days later, while exploring, Linda stumbles upon a waterfall and decides to take a moment to clean herself. As she enjoys the water, she suddenly hears something unusual, a distant engine. Looking out, she spots a boat nearby. She rushes forward, ready to call for help, but then hesitates. For a brief moment, she realizes something surprising. She's actually content here. Instead of signaling the boat, she turns back. Returning to camp, she brings Bradley water and shows him a makeshift backpack she's crafted from leaves. Bradley, however, is growing increasingly frustrated. It's been 2 weeks, and there's still no sign of rescue. When Linda encourages him to stay positive, he snaps, insisting they should build a raft and leave. Linda disagrees, warning him it's too dangerous. The conversation quickly escalates into a heated argument. Bradley begins to realize that Linda doesn't actually want to leave. She's comfortable here. Frustrated, he tries to storm off, though his injured leg slows him down. He lashes out, reminding her that he's the president of a major company and not someone to be dismissed. Linda laughs it off, pointing out that everything he's achieved came from his father and that he's just benefiting from it. When Bradley angrily fires her on the spot, she laughs even harder, completely unfazed. Determined to prove himself, Bradley sets out to build his own camp. But everything he attempts falls apart. Meanwhile, Linda thrives. She's constructed a sturdy shelter, made herself a hat, even set up a hammock. She has food, water, and a system that works. At one point, she even arranges branches on the beach to spell out, "Help." Starving, Bradley resorts to catching a bug and attempts to eat it, only to gag and spit it out in disgust. Eventually, swallowing his pride, he approaches Linda. By now, she's set up what looks like a full outdoor dining area, complete with a table and neatly prepared food resembling sushi. Trying to act friendly, Bradley attempts to reconnect, but Linda immediately flips the dynamic, pointing out that he has something stuck in his teeth mirroring his earlier insult. As he processes the embarrassment, he notices something else, a knife. When he asks about it, Linda casually explains that she found it washed up along the shore. Bradley begins to offer an apology for the way he's treated her, but Linda doesn't let him off that easily. She pushes him to go further, to really acknowledge what he's done. Reluctantly, he admits he underestimated both her abilities and her importance to the company. Linda responds by casually continuing her meal, deliberately ignoring him, dragging out the moment just to make him squirm. Eventually, desperation takes over. Bradley drops to his knees, promising to help in any way he can. As Linda keeps teasing him, he goes even further, pleading, humiliating himself, even awkwardly suggesting inappropriate favors. That's where Linda draws the line. She cuts him off immediately, but after a pause, she agrees to let him rejoin her. Later that afternoon, Linda takes Bradley out for a walk, using it as a way to help him slowly recover strength in his injured leg. Their path leads them up toward a mountain, where the terrain becomes narrow and dangerous. They're forced to make careful jumps across unstable ground. At one point, Linda shows him the vast stretch of ocean surrounding them, nothing but water in every direction, before guiding him onward. As they move through the island, she begins teaching him survival basics. She demonstrates how to test berries for toxicity by rubbing them on the skin and watching for any reaction. Then she points out a pair of rocks forming an X shape, warning him that beyond that area lies a zone filled with thorny bushes and poisonous vines. She makes it clear they must never go there if they want to stay alive. On the way back, Bradley stops to rest his leg. Without warning, the ground beneath Linda gives way, and she slips, barely managing to grab onto a cluster of vines to keep from falling. Bradley reacts instantly, grabbing her arm and pulling her back up to safety. They collapse together, laughing in relief after the scare. That evening, as they sit down to eat, Linda reveals she's been experimenting fermenting fruit to make alcohol. According to her, it's finally ready. By nightfall, they're both drinking, the tension between them softening. As the alcohol takes effect, Linda opens up about her past. She shares that she was once married, and the relationship lasted a decade before her husband died. But instead of sadness, she admits she felt little grief. He had been distant and unloving. Bradley relates in his own way, explaining that he never truly connected with his father, who was always consumed by work. His mother, meanwhile, was harsh and abusive, though Bradley tries to understand her, knowing she endured the same treatment from her own father. Encouraged by the conversation, Linda reveals more. Her husband, she says, was not just distant, he was abusive and struggled with alcohol. She used to hide his car keys when he drank too much, trying to prevent disaster. But one night, after a particularly intense argument where he treated her terribly, she gave up. She handed him the keys. He drove off and never came back. The accident that followed took his life. She's never told anyone this before. Quietly, she admits that maybe they shouldn't leave the island at all. The next morning, Linda wakes up with a pounding headache from the night before. Heading down to the shore to wash up, she notices Bradley bathing nearby, and for the first time, she sees him differently, realizing he's actually quite attractive. Later that day, a violent storm sweeps across the island. Winds roar through the trees, and at one point, Linda shoves Bradley out of the way just in time to save him from a collapsing trunk. With no other option, they run toward a nearby cave and take shelter until the storm passes. Inside, Bradley pulls Linda close, sharing warmth as they wait it out. When morning comes, Linda wakes to find herself alone. Concerned, she heads out to search for Bradley and finds him in the forest. Their camp has been completely destroyed by the storm. Feeling responsible, Linda apologizes for building too close to the shoreline. Bradley shrugs it off, suggesting they simply rebuild, this time on higher ground. Not long after, the two of them manage to create a new and improved camp. As Bradley continues recovering, they go on walks together, and he expresses genuine gratitude for everything she's taught him. That evening, he offers to prepare dinner, admitting it's the first time he's ever cooked anything himself. But as they eat, something feels off. Linda suddenly grows dizzy. It hits her quickly. He's used the wrong berries. Before she can react further, everything goes dark. Meanwhile, Bradley rushes into the forest and returns with a raft he's secretly been constructing. Wasting no time, he pushes it into the water and begins rowing away, determined to escape. A wave crashes into him, but the raft holds steady, and he celebrates prematurely, even mocking Linda from a distance. Then another wave hits. This time, the raft starts to come apart. A third, much stronger wave follows, completely destroying it and throwing Bradley into the ocean. He struggles to stay afloat, his strength fading. As he begins to lose consciousness, he hallucinates Zuri appearing before him, only for the vision to grotesquely distort. In reality, Linda has dragged him back to shore, despite still being weakened from the poison berries. She desperately performs CPR, though she can't stop herself from vomiting in the process, barely holding it together as she tries to save him. By morning, Bradley is alive. Linda feeds him quietly before explaining that he needs to understand something. He's no longer in control here. Almost immediately, Bradley starts feeling strange. His body grows heavy, unresponsive. Linda calmly reveals that she fed him a certain type of octopus, one that produces a toxin capable of blocking nerve signals. He remains fully conscious, but his body won't obey him. As the paralysis takes hold, Linda places her knife into the fire, heating it. She begins removing Bradley's clothes while casually talking about a dog she once had, how it was surgically altered to make it more obedient. She tells Bradley he needs to accept his new reality, that she's the one in charge now. Then she brings the heated knife dangerously close to him, making it seem like she's about to do something irreversible. Unable to move even his eyes, Bradley can only cry as blood splatters across his face. But moments later, Linda reveals the truth. It was all staged. She holds up a dead rat, showing him the source of the blood. It was just a warning. Calmly, she tells him that next time, it won't be. Eventually, the effects wear off, and Bradley regains movement. He continues working around the camp, though now he avoids interacting with Linda. Meanwhile, she heads off in search of fruit. On the far side of the island, she suddenly freezes. There's a boat approaching. To her shock, Zuri steps off and rushes toward her, embracing her warmly and even remembering her name. Linda tells them Bradley is alive and well, but deep down she feels conflicted. A part of her doesn't want this to end. As she leads Zuri and the boat's captain back toward the camp, she casually asks if there are other search teams nearby. They confirm there aren't. As it turns out, Zuri didn't wait for official rescue efforts. She hired a private boat and continued searching on her own. Taking advantage of the situation, Linda leads both Zuri and the captain up toward the mountain, claiming that her camp is just ahead. When they reach a narrow, unstable section of the path, Linda slows down, pretending to fix her shoelace, and casually tells them to go on without her. Zuri steps forward and instantly loses her footing, slipping over the edge. The captain lunges and manages to grab her, desperately calling out for Linda to help, but she just stands there, watching. She doesn't move. A short while later, Linda returns alone to the shoreline near the camp, sitting quietly as the weight of what just happened settles in. She tries to process it, but the guilt lingers beneath the surface. Back at camp, Bradley suggests they should go hunting again, but Linda brushes it off, saying she's taking the day off. Bradley points out that he can't manage on his own, his eyes drifting toward the knife nearby. That night, Linda begins hearing something strange, Zuri's voice faintly calling her name. She looks toward the water and sees what appears to be Zuri dragging herself out of the sea, accusing her of being a murderer. Panicked, Linda swings her torch wildly, only for the vision to vanish. It was all in her head. Then suddenly, a decayed figure lunges at her from behind, startling her awake. It was just a nightmare. The next morning, Bradley attempts to hunt by himself, but his inexperience shows. He makes too much noise, scaring off the boar. Frustrated, he wanders along the beach and notices something disturbing, a hand sticking out from the sand. As he digs, his expression shifts from confusion to horror when he uncovers Zuri's ring. The realization hits him hard, and he erupts in anger, sprinting back to camp. When Linda returns from a walk, Bradley confronts her, demanding to know if she killed Zuri, holding up the ring as proof. Linda insists it was an accident, that Zuri slipped, but admits she didn't tell him because she knew he wouldn't believe her. Bradley flatly says he still doesn't believe her. Then he brings up her husband, pushing her further. Linda reaches for the knife, but Bradley already has it. In an instant, she turns and runs. Bradley chases after her, but she disappears into the forest. As he searches, he spots her shoes near a tree. The moment he gets closer, Linda leaps out and wraps her shoelaces around his neck, trying to choke him. In the struggle, the knife slips from his hand. Bradley manages to break free, shoving her back while tearing at her scalp, but Linda immediately lunges again, continuing the fight. He tries to overpower her, grabbing her throat, but she bites down hard on his shoulder, ripping into him. Then she bites his hand. Desperate, Bradley jams his thumb into her eye to force her off. Linda grabs a rock and smashes it against his head, leaving him disoriented. Then she smiles, revealing she has Zuri's ring. Without hesitation, she swallows it and flips him off. Enraged, Bradley tackles her and the fight resumes. This time, Linda gets hold of the knife and drives it into his stomach. Wounded, Bradley stumbles away, fleeing deeper into the island. Linda considers chasing him, but when she sees the direction he's heading toward the area marked by the X-shaped rocks, she decides to wait. Moments later, Bradley emerges on the other side and realizes something shocking. The area Linda warned him about isn't deadly at all. Instead, it leads to a fully equipped vacation house. Staggering inside, he quickly grabs a cloth from the kitchen to press against his wound and gulps down fresh water from the fridge. As he tries to gather himself, he suddenly hears Linda's voice echoing through the house, mocking him. He rushes to open a drawer for a weapon, but every knife is gone. Linda's voice continues, taunting him. She reveals the truth. The knife she claimed to have found on the beach didn't wash up by chance. When she saw that boat days earlier, she followed it and watched workers unload supplies. She memorized the keypad code when they entered, then later broke in herself. She also confesses that she attacked the boat captain earlier, causing both him and Zuri to fall to their deaths. Realizing she's watching him through the security system, Bradley grabs an object and smashes one of the cameras. But it doesn't help. Linda still tracks his movements as he moves from room to room. Eventually, she corners him. This time, she's holding a gun. Broken and desperate, Bradley collapses emotionally. He admits everything, how awful he's been, how he treated her, how wrong he was. He insists he's changed because of her, calling her the most incredible person he's ever met. He even says he loves her, promising they could build a life together in this house. For a moment, Linda seems to soften. She tells him she loves him too. But then something catches her eye, a decorative helmet missing one of its horns. Bradley's hand is hidden behind his back. In a split second, he strikes, using the missing horn as a weapon. The surprise attack makes Linda drop the gun as he slashes at her. Bradley quickly grabs the firearm and pulls the trigger. Click, no bullets. Before he can react, Linda grabs a nearby golf club and swings, once, twice, again and again, until Bradley collapses, motionless. A year later, everything has changed. Linda is now living a completely different life, successful, confident, even playing golf alongside well-known figures. During an interview, a reporter recounts her story. She was discovered alone, drifting at sea on a raft. As far as anyone knows, she was the sole survivor. She's since written a best-selling book about her experience, with a film adaptation already in the works. And now, she's working on another project, a self-help book, teaching others how to survive and rely on themselves when it matters most. It all begins in a place that feels painfully familiar. Not a battlefield, not a haunted house, but a corporate office. Fluorescent lights, forced smiles. Quiet resentment simmering just beneath the surface. At the center of it all is Linda Little, a woman who works harder than everyone around her, yet somehow remains invisible, overlooked, undervalued. The kind of employee every company depends on but never rewards. She's promised a promotion, the kind that would finally validate years of effort, only to have it quietly taken away the moment new leadership steps in. And that leadership comes in the form of Bradley Preston, the boss who didn't earn his position but inherited it. Confident without competence, polished on the surface but hollow underneath. The kind of authority figure who doesn't just ignore talent, he replaces it. So right from the start, the imbalance is clear. This isn't just a professional relationship. It's a hierarchy built on entitlement versus effort, power versus invisibility. And then, everything breaks. What begins as a routine corporate trip, a hollow gesture disguised as opportunity, turns into something far more extreme. A sudden, intense disruption throws both of them out of that controlled world and into something raw, unpredictable, and completely unforgiving. A plane crash leaves them stranded, alone. No colleagues, no systems, no structure, no corporate ladder to climb or hide behind. Just two people. And suddenly, all those titles, boss, employee, superior, subordinate, they stop meaning anything. Because out here, survival doesn't care about your job title. It cares about what you can actually do. And that's where everything shifts. Linda, the one who was dismissed, ignored, underestimated, becomes the one who knows how to survive. She builds, adapts, figures things out. While Bradley, the man who once held all the power, is reduced to dependence, injured, disoriented, completely out of his depth, the balance flips. Not gradually, not subtly, but decisively. What used to be a workplace dynamic becomes something far more primal. Control isn't assigned anymore. It's taken, earned, fought for. And what makes this setup so compelling isn't just the survival aspect. It's what that survival reveals. Because this isn't just a story about being stranded on an island. It's a story about what happens when the systems that protect power disappear, and people are forced to confront who they really are without them. Resentment doesn't fade out here. It sharpens. Grievances don't get buried. They resurface. And every unspoken moment from that office, every slight, every dismissal, every quiet humiliation now has nowhere left to hide. This is where the film finds its core. Not in the crash, not even in the survival, but in the collision between two people who were never equal to begin with. now forced into a situation where everything has been stripped away except the truth of who holds power and why. And from that moment on, it's no longer about getting off the island. It's about who controls it. One of the first things you notice about Send Help is that it refuses to sit still. It doesn't belong to one genre, it doesn't follow one tone, and it definitely doesn't play by one set of rules. On paper, you could call it a survival thriller. Two people stranded on an island, fighting to stay alive. And yes, that framework is there. The isolation, the physical struggle, the unpredictability of nature, but that's just the surface. Because layered underneath that is something much darker and much stranger. This is also a horror film, not just in the traditional sense, although there are moments of intense discomfort, unease, and physical strain, but in the psychological space it occupies. The kind of horror that comes from watching people unravel, from seeing control shift, from realizing that the real danger isn't the environment, it's the person standing right next to you. And then, almost unexpectedly, it leans into comedy. Not light, easy comedy. Not the kind that gives you relief. This is black humor. Awkward, uncomfortable, sometimes even unsettling. The kind of humor that makes you laugh and then immediately question why you did. Moments of physical absurdity sit right next to scenes of genuine tension. Characters say things that are funny, but also cutting. Situations escalate to the point where they feel ridiculous, until they suddenly don't. And that's where the film becomes something even more unusual. Because beyond survival, beyond horror, beyond comedy, there's satire. A sharp, underlying commentary on corporate culture, power structures, and social dynamics. The island may be physically isolated, but everything that happens there is rooted in the systems the characters came from. The workplace doesn't disappear, it mutates. Hierarchy becomes dominance. Professional rivalry becomes deeply personal conflict, and the rules of society become something far more primal. The result is a film that constantly shifts its identity. One moment, it feels like a grounded survival story. The next, it slips into something exaggerated, almost absurd. Then suddenly, it turns unsettling, quiet, tense, and just when you think you've figured out its rhythm, it changes again. For some, that unpredictability is exactly what makes it work. It feels bold, different, hard to define. Like the film is constantly keeping you off balance, never letting you settle into comfort. But for others, that same quality becomes its biggest weakness. Because blending genres like this isn't easy, and at times the transitions aren't seamless. The humor can undercut the tension. The psychological intensity can feel restrained when it should go further. The satire can feel a little too obvious or too scattered. There are moments where it feels like the film is trying to do everything at once and not always landing every piece with the precision it needs. Especially early on, where the tone leans a bit too broad, almost sitcom-like, before it eventually finds its darker, more confident identity. But once it locks in, once the film fully commits to that mix of discomfort, tension, and dark absurdity, it becomes something far more engaging. Because at its best, Send Help doesn't just blend genres, it weaponizes them. It uses comedy to make the tension sharper. It uses tension to make the satire more uncomfortable. And it uses both to keep you constantly unsure of what's coming next. In that uncertainty, that constant tonal instability, that's not just a stylistic choice, it's part of the experience. Because just like the characters, you're never completely in control of how you're supposed to feel. At its core, Send Help isn't really about survival. It's about power. Who has it? Who loses it? And what people are willing to do once the balance shifts. Because before the island, the hierarchy is crystal clear. Linda is at the bottom. Hardworking, capable, invisible. The kind of person a company depends on, but never rewards. Bradley is at the top. Not because he earned it, but because he inherited it. Authority without effort. Confidence without substance. It's a system we recognize instantly. Corporate favoritism. Nepotism. Quiet exploitation. Linda does the work. Bradley takes the credit. And when the moment comes to reward her, she's passed over without hesitation. That imbalance isn't just background, it's the foundation of everything that follows. Because when the plane crashes, that system disappears. No titles, no offices, no structure to hide behind. And suddenly, power has to be redefined. Out here, survival becomes the only currency that matters, and Linda, the one who was ignored, is the one who knows how to survive. She builds shelter, finds food, adapts. Bradley, the man who once controlled her future, can't even function without her. And just like that, the hierarchy flips. But what makes this dynamic so compelling is that it doesn't stop at reversal, it evolves. Because this isn't a clean shift from victim to hero and oppressor to failure. It's something much messier. Linda doesn't just gain control, she holds on to it, tightly, maybe too tightly. What begins as survival slowly becomes something else. Control turns into dominance. Dependence turns into leverage. And resentment, the kind built over years of being overlooked, starts to surface in ways that feel deliberate and deeply personal. And Bradley? He doesn't just accept his fall, he resists it, he strategizes, he adapts, he looks for openings. Because even stripped of his authority, he still believes he deserves it. And that's where the film becomes something deeper. Because it's no longer just about who can survive, it's about who deserves control. And more importantly, what happens when someone who has never had power finally gets it? Does it make them better, more fair, more justified, or does it reveal something more complicated? The film doesn't offer easy answers. Instead, it pushes both characters into morally uncomfortable territory. There's no clear hero here, no one to fully align with. Just two people, shaped by a broken system, now recreating that same system in a completely different form. The workplace may be gone, but the power struggle isn't. It's just been stripped down to its most basic form. And that's what makes Send Help so effective on a thematic level. Because beneath the survival, beneath the tension, it's a story about how power operates, how it influences behavior, how it shifts, and how, no matter where you go, people tend to rebuild the same hierarchies they were trying to escape, just with different rules, and far fewer consequences. Linda Little is not the kind of character most films would make easy for you. She's not instantly likable, she's not effortlessly charming, and she's definitely not written to make you comfortable, and that's exactly what makes her so compelling. When we first meet her, she exists in the margins of her own workplace, quiet, awkward, socially disconnected, the kind of person who struggles to fit into the very system she works so hard to support. She's competent, more than competent actually, smart, prepared, detail-oriented. But none of that translates into status, because in that environment, skill isn't enough. You need presence, confidence, the ability to navigate people, not just problems. And that's where Linda falls short. She doesn't play the game well, she doesn't connect easily, she doesn't command attention. So she gets overlooked, dismissed, reduced to background noise in a room where she probably understands more than anyone else. And you feel that frustration early on, not just in what happens to her, but in how she carries it. It's quiet, internal, controlled, but it's there. Then the world changes. The crash strips everything down to its most basic level, and suddenly, all the things that held Linda back stop mattering. Out here, survival isn't about charisma, it's about capability. And this is where the film does something really interesting. Because Linda doesn't just adapt, she thrives. All those things that felt like quirks in the office, her preparation, her knowledge, her isolation, suddenly become strengths. She knows what to do. She knows how to survive. She becomes the one in control. And for a moment, it feels empowering. Like this is the version of her that was always there, just waiting for the right environment to emerge. But the film doesn't stop there. Because Linda's transformation isn't just about confidence, it's about control. And slowly, that control starts to shift into something more unsettling. She doesn't just take charge, she holds on to it, even when she doesn't need to, even when there are chances to let go, and that's where her character becomes unpredictable. Because you're no longer watching someone simply survive, you're watching someone who's been overlooked for so long, finally experience power, and not want to give it back. Her vulnerability doesn't disappear. It coexists with something sharper, something more deliberate. She can still be awkward, still uncertain, still human. But now there's an edge, a quiet intensity that makes you question her decisions and her intentions. And that's what makes Linda such a fascinating character. She doesn't fit into a clean arc. She's not just a victim rising to strength. And she's not a straightforward antagonist either. She exists somewhere in between, messy, complicated, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes unsettling. And the film leans into that ambiguity. It doesn't soften her, it doesn't justify everything she does. It simply lets her evolve, and leaves you to figure out how you feel about her. Because in the end, Linda isn't just a character who changes because of the island. She's a character who reveals who she's always been, once the world around her stops holding her back. If Linda represents the person who never got the power she deserved, Bradley represents the person who got it without earning it. From the moment he's introduced, everything about him signals control. Not competence, not capability. Control. He's the boss, but not because he built anything. Not because he proved himself. He's there because the system put him there, because he inherited authority and never had to question whether he deserved it, and that shapes everything about him. He's confident, but it's hollow. He's assertive, but it's performative. He makes decisions, but rarely takes responsibility for them. There's an ease to the way he dismisses people, especially Linda. A casual disregard that doesn't even register as such to him. Because in his world, that's just how things work. People like him move forward. People like her stay where they are, and he never has to think twice about it. But then the crash happens, and suddenly, all the things that defined Bradley, his status, his authority, his environment, disappear. Completely. Out on that island, there's no title protecting him. No system reinforcing his position. No one to impress. No one to command. And what's left is someone who doesn't know how to function without it. He's injured, disoriented, dependent. For the first time, he's not in control of the situation, or even himself. And that shift is intense. Because Bradley isn't just losing power. He's being forced to confront the fact that he never really had the kind of power that matters. He can't survive on his own. He can't adapt. He can't lead. Everything he relied on doesn't exist here. And the one person he once dismissed is now the reason he's still alive. But what makes Bradley interesting is that he doesn't fully break. He adjusts. Not in the way Linda does, through growth or transformation, but through instinct, through manipulation, through resistance, through a quiet refusal to accept his new place in the hierarchy. Because even when he's at his weakest, he still believes he should be in charge, and that belief doesn't go away. It lingers in how he speaks, in how he reacts, in the small, calculated ways he tries to regain control. There are moments where he recognizes his dependence, where he softens, adapts, even seems to understand his position. But those moments don't last, because Bradley isn't built to exist without power, so he looks for ways to take it back, subtly at first, then more directly. And that's where his character becomes more than just a one-dimensional antagonist, because beneath the arrogance there's insecurity, there's entitlement, and there's a deep, almost unconscious belief that the world should work in his favor, even when it clearly doesn't anymore. Some interpretations see layers in him, glimpses of awareness, of adaptability, of something more complex beneath the surface. Others see him as exactly what he appears to be, a product of a system that rewards the wrong people, now exposed in an environment where those rewards mean nothing. But either way, he serves a critical purpose. Because without Bradley, without everything he represents, Linda's transformation doesn't carry the same weight. He is the contrast, the before, the system she was trapped in. And when that system collapses, he doesn't just lose control of the situation. He becomes the proof that he never truly deserved it in the first place. For a film this contained, this stripped down, this dependent on just two people carrying almost the entire weight of the story, everything comes down to performance, and Send Help knows it. Because at the center of all the chaos, all the tonal shifts, all the thematic layers, there are two actors holding it all together. And if they don't work, none of this works. Starting with Rachel McAdams, this is her film. Not just because she has the most screen time, but because she's asked to do the most emotionally, psychologically, tonally, and she delivers. What makes her performance stand out isn't just range, it's how seamlessly she moves through it. She can be awkward, almost painfully so, in one moment. Quiet, withdrawn, unsure of herself. And then, without warning, she shifts. Confidence creeps in. Control takes shape. And suddenly there's something unstable just beneath the surface. She doesn't flip a switch, she evolves. Gradually, unevenly, uncomfortably. Sometimes within the same scene, there are moments where she feels vulnerable, and then moments later, there's something colder in her eyes, something more deliberate. And that tension, that unpredictability, is what makes her so hard to look away from. She doesn't ask you to like her. She doesn't even ask you to understand her. She just fully commits. And because of that, even when the film stumbles, she doesn't. Then there's Dylan O'Brien. And what he does here is just as important because he leans completely into a role that isn't designed to be liked. Bradley is abrasive, entitled, often frustrating to watch. And O'Brien doesn't soften that, he amplifies it. There's a sharpness to his performance, a kind of controlled arrogance that makes every interaction feel slightly off balance. But underneath that, there's something else. Because as the film progresses and the power dynamic shifts, he doesn't just stay static, he adjusts. You start to see cracks, moments where the confidence slips, where the control disappears, where survival forces him into unfamiliar territory. And O'Brien plays that transition carefully, not as a complete transformation, but as someone trying to hold onto who they were, while clearly losing that grip. And that's what keeps his performance from becoming one note. But the real strength of the film is what happens when you put these two performances together. Because this isn't just about two strong actors, it's about how they interact. Their chemistry isn't built on warmth or connection, it's built on tension, on friction, on a constant push and pull between control and resistance. Every conversation feels like a negotiation, every silence feels loaded. There's always something underneath what's being said, something unspoken, unresolved. At times, they seem like they might understand each other. At other times, it feels like they're on completely different wavelengths, circling each other, testing boundaries, waiting for the other to break, and that dynamic evolves. What starts as a clear imbalance slowly becomes a battle, not just physically, but psychologically. And the film relies on that, because there's nowhere else to hide, no large ensemble to fall back on, no external storyline to distract you. It's just them. And that's why, even in moments where the tone shifts awkwardly or the writing doesn't fully land, the performances keep you engaged. They ground the film, they give it weight, and most importantly, they make you care, even when you're not entirely sure who you're supposed to care about. That's not easy to pull off. But here, it works. If there's one area where Send Help really divides people, it's the pacing. Because this isn't a film that rushes into its premise. It takes its time. And that choice is either one of its strengths or one of its biggest frustrations. The film opens in the corporate world, and instead of jumping straight into the survival setup, it lingers there. We spend time with Linda, with the office dynamic, with the quiet tension that's been building long before anything goes wrong. For some viewers, that works, because it gives context, it builds the emotional groundwork. It shows you exactly what Linda has been dealing with, and why everything that happens later matters. So when the shift comes, when the environment changes, it feels earned. But for others, that opening stretch feels off, too broad, too exaggerated. Almost like the film hasn't quite figured out what it wants to be yet. There's a slightly awkward tone in those early scenes, moments that lean a bit too close to sitcom territory before the film fully settles into its darker identity, and that creates a kind of initial wobble. But once the story moves past that, once the crash happens and the island takes over, the structure tightens, the film becomes contained, focused, locked into a single location with just two characters carrying the entire narrative, and that's where it finds its rhythm. From that point on, the story is less about plot progression and more about escalation. Each scene builds on the last, not through major external events, but through shifts in behavior, changes in control, moments of tension, small decisions that slowly spiral into something bigger. It becomes a psychological progression rather than a traditional one. And for a while, that works really well. There's a sense of momentum, even without constant action, because the dynamic between the characters keeps evolving. You're not just waiting for what happens next, you're watching how things change. But this is also where the structure starts to split opinion again. Some viewers see it as tight and efficient, a focused, character-driven narrative that doesn't waste time on distractions. Others see it as uneven, episodic, a series of moments rather than a smoothly flowing arc. There are points where the film seems to drift, where the pacing slows just enough for the tension to lose a bit of its edge, and that middle stretch is where some people start to feel it. Not because nothing is happening, but because it feels like the film is circling its core idea rather than pushing forward. Then comes the final act, and this is where the film makes a decisive move. It escalates, the tone sharpens, the intensity rises, and everything that's been building starts to pay off. For some, this is where the film fully clicks, where the earlier setup, the measured build, the character groundwork, finally justifies itself. The tension becomes more direct, the conflict becomes more explosive. and the film leans fully into what it's been setting up. But for others, that payoff doesn't quite land the way it should. Maybe it's because certain reveals come too early. Maybe it's because the film stretches its build-up just a little too far. Or maybe it's simply that the ending can't quite match the promise of what came before. And that's the challenge with a structure like this. When you build slowly, when you rely on escalation rather than constant movement, the final act has to deliver, because everything depends on it. And in Send Help, whether that structure works or not, comes down to how you feel about where it all leads. If there's one thing Send Help constantly reminds you of, it's who's behind the camera. Because no matter how much the film leans into survival, satire, or character drama, there's a distinct presence running through it, and that presence is unmistakably Sam Raimi. You can feel it in the way scenes are staged, in the way discomfort is pushed just a little further than expected, in the way the film doesn't just present intensity, it plays with it. This isn't clean horror, it's messy, physical, unpleasant, sometimes even exaggerated in how far it goes. The kind of horror that doesn't just aim to unsettle you, it wants to make you shift in your seat. There are moments where the film leans into pure bodily discomfort, where the camera lingers just long enough to make you uneasy, where the impact isn't just emotional, it's deeply sensory, and that's where Raimi's signature style really comes through. Because his approach to horror has never been about quiet tension alone, it's about exaggeration, about pushing reactions, about turning something unsettling into something almost theatrical. And Send Help taps into that. You get flashes of that chaotic energy, bursts of high-intensity confrontation, unsettling imagery, and physical comedy that feel deliberately heightened. Moments where the film suddenly shifts gears and becomes more aggressive, more unpredictable, more willing to cross boundaries. And when it does, that's when it feels most alive. But here's where things get interesting, because not everyone agrees on how far the film actually goes. For some viewers, this is Raimi fully back in his element. The discomfort lands, the intensity hits. The escalating tension builds in a way that feels familiar, almost like a return to form. Those heightened moments, the physical strain, the relentless pressure placed on the characters, it all clicks. But for others, it doesn't go far enough. There's a sense that the film holds back, that it edges toward extremes without fully committing to them, that the horror is present but restrained. And that creates a kind of tension within the film itself, because you can see what it's capable of. You can feel the moments where it almost tips into something more intense, more chaotic, more unforgettable, but then it pulls back, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. And that balance between control and excess becomes part of the experience. Then there's the final act. And this is where the film makes its biggest move, because whatever restraint existed earlier starts to fade. The intensity becomes more direct, more aggressive, more in line with what you expect from Raimi at his most uninhibited. The physicality increases, the discomfort sharpens. The tone shifts towards something harsher, less contained. And for many viewers, that's where the film finally delivers on its promise, where the tension stops being a layer and becomes the driving force. But even then, the question lingers. Is it enough? Does it push far enough to leave a lasting impression? Or does it stop just short of the kind of full-throttle chaos that Raimi is known for? That answer will vary depending on what you're expecting. But one thing is clear. Whether it goes all the way or not, Send Help never lets you forget the filmmaker behind it. Because even in its quieter moments, even when it's holding back, there's always that underlying sense that things could escalate further. And sometimes they do. The comedy in Send Help isn't there to comfort you. It's there to unsettle you. And that's an important distinction, because this isn't the kind of film where the jokes give you relief from the tension. If anything, they make the tension worse. From the very beginning, the humor leans into something awkward, sharp, and slightly uncomfortable. It comes from character interactions, from social dynamics, from moments that feel just a little too real, and then pushes them into exaggeration. People say things they shouldn't. Situations escalate in ways that feel absurd, until they don't. And you find yourself reacting, but not in a relaxed way. In that hesitant, almost guilty way, where you're not entirely sure how you're supposed to feel. That's the film operating at its best. Because when the humor works, it feels deliberate, cutting even. It exposes character flaws. It highlights power imbalances. It turns uncomfortable situations into something strangely engaging. There are specific moments, small beats, reactions, exchanges that land perfectly. the kind of scenes where the absurdity and the tension collide in just the right way. And when that happens, the film feels sharp, confident, in control of its tone. But then there are other moments where that balance slips, where the humor feels off. Not necessarily because the moment itself is wrong, but because the tone around it doesn't quite support it. Some scenes feel like they belong to a different version of the film, too broad, too exaggerated, almost leaning into something lighter when everything else is pulling darker. And that disconnect can be jarring, especially in the earlier parts of the film, where the comedy sometimes feels like it's trying too hard, pushing for reactions before the film has fully settled into its identity. Then there's the physical, more extreme side of the humor, the deliberately uncomfortable elements. And this is where the film becomes the most divisive, because these moments are intentionally excessive. They're messy, unpleasant, designed to provoke a reaction. For some viewers, that's exactly what makes them work. They're bold, unfiltered, perfectly in line with the film's darker tone. But for others, they don't land as humor at all. They're just uncomfortable, not engaging, not entertaining, just too much. And that's the risk the film takes. It doesn't try to appeal to everyone. It leans into a very specific kind of humor, one that sits right on the edge between funny and unsettling, and depending on where you fall, it either enhances the experience or pulls you out of it. But even when the humor doesn't fully land, it still serves a purpose. Because it's not just there to entertain, it's there to reflect the characters, their harshness, their awkwardness, their instability. The humor isn't separate from the story, it is the story. It reveals how these characters think, how they react, how they deal with pressure. And as the film progresses, as the situation becomes more intense, the humor starts to change. It becomes sharper, darker, more uncomfortable, less about punchlines and more about the tension underneath them. So by the time the film reaches its later stages, you're not just reacting to these moments, you're reacting to what they say about the people delivering them. And that's when the comedy becomes something more than just a tonal layer. It becomes part of the film's identity, unpredictable, uncomfortable, and never entirely safe, just like everything else in Send Help. For a film that spends most of its time in one location, Send Help never feels visually small. In fact, one of its biggest strengths is how much it gets out of that isolation, because the island isn't just a backdrop. It's a presence. It's beautiful and threatening at the same time. Wide, sweeping shots capture the scale of it. The endless horizon, the open sky, the sense of being completely cut off from everything. But then, the film pulls you in. Tight close-ups. Uncomfortable framing. Angles that feel slightly off, slightly distorted. And suddenly, that same space starts to feel claustrophobic. That contrast between openness and confinement is where the cinematography really works. It mirrors the characters. Outwardly, they're free. No rules, no system. But internally, they're trapped, and the camera reflects that. There are moments where the visuals feel clean and controlled, almost calm, and then there are moments where everything becomes more aggressive, more stylized, more Raimi. You start to notice the shifts, the way the camera lingers just a little longer than expected, the way certain shots are framed to heighten discomfort, the way movement and composition begin to feel more chaotic as the tension builds. It's not just about showing what's happening, it's about making you feel it. And for the most part, that works. The island looks stunning, but never safe. Every location serves a purpose, whether it's emphasizing survival, isolation, or confrontation. And even in a limited setting, the film finds ways to keep things visually engaging. But then we get to the effects. And this is where things become more uneven. On one side, you have the practical elements, the physicality, the messiness, the tangible details, blood, dirt, sweat, everything that makes the environment feel real. Those moments land, they have weight, you can feel them. They ground the film, especially during the more intense sequences. But on the other side, there's the CGI, and this is where the illusion starts to crack a little. Certain sequences, especially the larger, more ambitious ones, rely heavily on digital effects, and while some of it works, other parts feel noticeable, less convincing, less integrated. Moments that are supposed to feel raw end up feeling slightly artificial. And when that happens, it pulls you out of the experience, even if only briefly. It's not enough to undermine the film, but it's enough to stand out. Because everything else is trying so hard to feel grounded, and then suddenly, there's a layer that doesn't quite match. That said, the film still knows how to stage a scene. The bigger sequences, the crash, the confrontations, the physical struggles are directed with confidence. You always understand what's happening. You feel the impact. And visually, the film never feels sloppy. Even when the effects don't fully land, the intention behind them is clear. And then there's the overall presentation. This is a film that benefits from being seen on a larger screen. The scale of the island, the detail in the environment, the intensity of the close-ups. It all comes together in a way that feels immersive. Even the more stylized moments, the ones that lean into exaggeration, feel purposeful within that space. So while the visuals aren't flawless, they're effective. They support the story, they enhance the tone, and they give the film a sense of identity that goes beyond its limited setting. Because at the end of the day, Send Help doesn't just show you survival. It makes you feel the space those characters are trapped in. And sometimes, that's more important than perfection. There's something quietly powerful happening beneath Send Help, something you don't always notice right away, but you feel it, in the tension, in the silence, in the moments where nothing is happening, but everything feels like it's about to. And a big part of that comes from the score, driven by the unmistakable touch of Danny Elfman. This isn't a score that overwhelms the film. It doesn't demand attention. Instead, it works underneath the surface, shaping the mood, guiding the rhythm, and slowly tightening the emotional grip of each scene. There are moments where it feels almost minimal, subtle pulses, uneasy tones, just enough to let you know that something isn't right. And then, there are moments where it becomes more pronounced, more urgent, more chaotic, more reflective of what's happening internally, rather than just what's happening on screen. Because the music here isn't just reacting to events, it's reacting to people, to shifts in control, to rising tension, to the slow unraveling of both characters. As the dynamic between Linda and Bradley becomes more unstable, the score follows. It stretches, it distorts, it builds pressure in ways that aren't always obvious, but are always effective. And just as important as the music is the use of silence. There are stretches of the film where the absence of sound becomes just as powerful as the presence of it. Moments where the island feels too quiet, where the lack of noise creates its own kind of tension. You start listening more closely. To footsteps, to breathing, to the smallest movements. Because in a setting like this, silence isn't peaceful, it's unsettling. It makes every interaction feel heavier, every pause feel intentional, every look feel loaded. And that's where the film's atmosphere really comes together. It's not just built through visuals or performance, it's built through feeling. Through the combination of sound, music, and silence working together to create something that sits just under your skin. The island starts to feel alive, not because of what it shows you, but because of what it suggests, that something is always shifting, that something is always building, that things could escalate at any moment. And even when the tone of the film shifts, when it moves between tension, dark humor, and unease, the atmosphere holds, it adapts, sometimes amplifying the chaos, sometimes grounding it, but always keeping you connected to that underlying sense of instability. It's not loud, it's not constant, but it's there, guiding the experience, shaping how you react, even when you don't realize it. Because in Send Help, what you hear and what you don't hear is just as important as what you see. What really anchors Send Help, what stays with you after the credits roll, are the moments. Not just the story, not just the themes, but the set pieces, the sequences where everything the film is building suddenly comes into focus. And it starts with the crash, because this isn't just a plot device, it's an impact. Chaotic, disorienting, sudden. One moment, everything is controlled, structured, corporate, predictable. And the next, it's gone. The shift is intense, immediate. And it sets the tone for everything that follows. From that point on, the film trades large-scale spectacle for something more contained, but no less intense. Because once they reach the island, the set pieces become more personal, more physical, more uncomfortable. Survival isn't clean here, it's messy, improvised, sometimes overwhelming. There are sequences centered around finding food, building shelter, adapting to the environment, but they're not framed as triumphant survival moments. They're framed as tests of endurance, of capability, of control. And that's where the film starts to lean into its most memorable territory. Because it doesn't just show survival, it pushes it. There are moments that move into discomfort, scenes that linger just long enough to make you uneasy, where physical struggle becomes harder to watch, where the line between necessity and something more starts to blur. And then there are the confrontations. Not always explosive, not always loud, but tense. Every interaction between Linda and Bradley carries weight, and certain moments turn that tension into something sharper, more direct, more volatile. You can feel the shift when control changes hands, when one character gains the upper ground, when something unspoken finally surfaces. Those are the scenes that stay with you, not because they're big, but because they're loaded. Then the film escalates. As it moves toward the final act, the set pieces become more intense, more extreme. The physicality increases, the conflict sharpens, the restraint begins to slip. This is where the film starts to fully embrace its darker side. Moments become harder to predict, harder to categorize, and harder to forget. There's a sense that everything has been building toward this, that all the smaller, quieter moments were leading here, to something more unfiltered, more confrontational, more final. And while not every sequence lands equally for every viewer, there's no denying that the film knows how to create impact. It knows when to hold back and when to push forward. It knows how to make a moment feel uncomfortable, and then sit with that discomfort just long enough to leave an impression. Because in the end, Send Help isn't defined by one single scene. It's defined by the accumulation of them, each moment building on the last, until you're left with something that feels less like a series of events and more like a series of experiences you went through alongside the characters. And some of those experiences are not easy to shake off. Most films make it easy for you. They tell you who to align with, who to trust, who deserves to come out on top. Send Help doesn't do that. In fact, it does the opposite, because the longer you spend with these characters, the less certain you become. At the beginning, it feels straightforward. Linda is the underdog, overlooked, undervalued, treated unfairly. Bradley is the problem, entitled, dismissive, clearly in the wrong. And naturally, your sympathy leans one way. You understand her, you want to see her rise, you want to see the balance corrected, but then the film starts to shift. Subtly at first, small decisions, small behaviors, moments that feel slightly off. Linda begins to change, not just in confidence, but in intent. And suddenly, the person you were rooting for starts to become harder to fully support. At the same time, Bradley, despite everything he represents, doesn't stay static either. He adapts, he reacts, he reveals different sides of himself. Not necessarily better ones, but more human ones. And that's where the film destabilizes your perspective, because it refuses to keep things clean. It doesn't give you a clear hero, and it doesn't give you a clear villain. Instead, it gives you two people, both shaped by the same system, both flawed, both reactive, both capable of making decisions that are difficult to justify. And the more the story progresses, the more those lines blur. Victim becomes aggressor. Authority becomes dependency. Control shifts again and again. There are moments where you find yourself switching sides, understanding one character, then the other, agreeing with the decision, then immediately questioning it. And that constant shift is intentional, because the film isn't interested in making you comfortable. It's interested in making you think about power, about fairness, about what people do when they're pushed, and what they become when they finally push back. But there's a trade-off, because when you remove a clear point of emotional alignment, you also risk losing catharsis. That feeling of release, that sense of resolution. If no one is fully right, then no outcome feels fully satisfying. And that's exactly what happens here for some viewers. And slowly, that begins to take a toll. You see it in the way they speak to each other, in the way they react, in the way small frustrations turn into something much bigger. The line between rational and irrational starts to blur. Decisions become harder to understand. Motivations become more extreme. And what once felt controlled starts to feel unstable. There are moments where you can feel that shift happening, where something changes, not dramatically, but just enough to signal that things aren't as grounded as they used to be. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back. Because isolation doesn't just challenge people, it reveals them. It strips away everything external, until all that's left is how they think, how they react, how they deal with pressure. And in Send Help, that revelation isn't comforting. It's unsettling. Because as the film progresses, it becomes clear that the real danger isn't the island. It's what happens when two people are left alone long enough for their thoughts, their emotions, and their instincts to turn inward, and eventually against each other. There's a bold simplicity at the heart of Send Help. It doesn't try to be everywhere. It doesn't cut away to subplots. It doesn't check in with the outside world. It doesn't give you relief through distraction. Instead, it confines you in one place, with two people, and nowhere else to go. And that choice defines the entire experience. Because once the film leaves the office behind, it commits. The island becomes everything. There are no rescue missions happening off-screen, no parallel stories unfolding somewhere else, no constant reminders of the world they left behind. Just isolation. And that isolation isn't just physical, it's narrative. You are locked into this space with them. Every moment, every interaction, every shift in their dynamic, you experience it alongside them. And that's where the film's structure becomes one of its biggest strengths. Because by limiting the scope, it intensifies the focus. There's no room for filler, no room to hide behind spectacle or distraction. Everything has to come from the characters, from what they say, what they do, what they don't say. And that's what makes this a true two-hander. The entire film rests on the relationship between Linda and Bradley, their tension, their conflict, their evolving power dynamic. Every scene builds on that. Every moment either pushes them closer or pulls them further apart. And because there's nothing else competing for attention, you feel it more. The awkwardness is sharper, the tension is clearer, the shifts in control are more noticeable. Even silence becomes important. Because when you're confined like this, there's no background noise to absorb the tension. It just sits there, between them, between you, and that creates a very specific kind of engagement. You're not just watching a story unfold, you're watching a relationship deteriorate, evolve, and reshape itself in real time, and that can be incredibly compelling, because it feels immediate, focused, intimate. But it also comes with a challenge, because when a film limits itself this much, there's nothing to fall back on. If the characters don't work, if the dynamic isn't strong enough, the entire structure collapses. There's no secondary plot to support it, no spectacle to distract you. Just two people. And in Send Help, that risk pays off, largely because of how strong that central dynamic is. The tension between them carries the film. The unpredictability of their interactions keeps it moving. And the constant push and pull of control gives it momentum. Even when the pacing slows, even when the story takes a breath, you're still watching. Because you want to see what happens next, not in the world, but between them. And that's the power of containment. By shrinking the scale, the film expands the intensity and turns a simple setup into something that feels much bigger than it actually is. Not every film is built the same way. Some are designed to stay with you, to pull you back in, to reward you every time you revisit them. Others? They're built for the moment, for the experience, for that first watch where everything is fresh, unpredictable, and unfolding in real time. Send Help sits right on that line. Because while it's undeniably engaging, the question is, how much of that engagement carries over once you already know what's coming? On a first viewing, the film works. The tension is effective. The dynamic between the characters is compelling. You're constantly watching to see how far things will go and how the balance will shift. There's a sense of discovery, of uncertainty. You don't fully know what these characters are capable of. You don't fully know where the story is heading. And that unpredictability is a big part of what makes it engaging. But then comes the second question. What happens when that uncertainty is gone? Because once you know the reveals, once you understand the character motivations, once you've seen how everything plays out, the film changes. Not necessarily for the worse, but definitely in how it feels. Some viewers find that it still holds up, that the performances become even more interesting on a second watch. You start noticing details you missed before. Small behaviors, subtle hints, moments that make more sense with context. The film becomes less about what happens and more about why it happens, and in that sense, there is value in revisiting it. But for others, that initial impact doesn't translate, because so much of the experience is tied to tension, to discomfort, to not knowing where things are going. And once that's gone, what's left feels lighter, still engaging, but not as gripping, still interesting, but not as urgent. It becomes something you appreciate, more than something you feel the need to go back to. And that's where the divide really shows. Some see it as a film worth revisiting, to re-experience the performances, to catch new layers, to see how it holds up with full context. Others see it as a strong one-time watch, something that works in the moment, delivers what it needs to, and then doesn't necessarily call you back. And neither perspective is wrong. because Send Help isn't built around twists alone, but it does rely heavily on tension and escalation, and those are elements that naturally land with more intensity the first time. Still, even if it doesn't become a repeat watch for everyone, it leaves an impression. Maybe not one that demands revisiting, but one that stays with you, at least for a while, because you remember the experience, the discomfort, the dynamic, the moments that made you react. And sometimes, that's enough. Not every film needs to be endlessly rewatchable. Some just need to deliver a strong, memorable experience the first time you see them. And Send Help, whether you return to it or not, does exactly that. Before Send Help finds its identity, it stumbles. And that stumble happens right at the beginning, because the opening stretch of the film feels off, not broken, not unwatchable, but misaligned. The tone leans in a direction that doesn't quite match what the film eventually becomes. There's a noticeable push towards something broader, more exaggerated, almost sitcom-like in places. Characters feel slightly heightened. Interactions feel a bit forced. The humor feels like it's reaching, trying to land before the film has earned it. And for a moment, you start to question what kind of film this actually is. Is it a satire? A comedy? Something lighter than expected? Because those early scenes don't fully reflect the darker, more controlled tone that the film is clearly aiming for, and that creates a disconnect. It's not that the ideas aren't there, it's that they haven't settled yet. The film hasn't found its rhythm. It's still figuring itself out, and you can feel that uncertainty. The pacing feels slightly uneven. The tone shifts a little too quickly. The balance between humor and seriousness hasn't locked in yet. But then, something changes. As the story moves forward, as the setup gives way to the central premise, the film begins to stabilize. The tone sharpens. The humor becomes more intentional. The tension starts to take priority. And suddenly, it feels like you're watching a different film, a more confident one, a more focused one. The exaggerated edges smooth out. The awkwardness fades, and the film finally leans into what it actually wants to be, a dark, uncomfortable blend of tension, psychological conflict, and sharp satire. And once it gets there, that early wobble becomes less important, because the film starts to work. But that opening still matters, because first impressions shape expectations, and for some viewers, that initial tone creates a barrier. It takes time to adjust, time to recalibrate what you're watching. And not everyone is willing to wait for that shift. For others, it's just a rough start to an otherwise engaging experience, something the film grows out of, something that fades as the story finds its footing. But either way, it's a reminder of how important tone is, especially in a film that blends genres. Because when you're asking the audience to navigate multiple emotional spaces, you need to guide them carefully. And in Send Help, that guidance doesn't fully click until after the journey has already begun. Once it does, the film becomes much more assured. But getting there takes a little time. There's an interesting contradiction at the heart of Send Help, because on paper, it's not an overly long film, and yet, for some viewers, it feels like one. And that difference, between actual runtime and perceived runtime, comes down to momentum. Because this is a film built on tension, escalation, and character dynamics. And when those elements are working, the film moves. It feels tight, focused, engaging. Scenes flow into each other. The conflict builds. The pacing feels intentional. Time doesn't drag, it passes. But when that momentum slips, even slightly, you start to feel it. Not because the story stops, but because it slows just enough to interrupt the rhythm. There are stretches, particularly in the middle, where the film lingers, where it circles its central dynamic instead of pushing it forward. And in those moments, the pacing becomes noticeable. You start to feel the runtime. You become aware of the structure, not in a way that completely disengages you, but enough to create a slight distance, a sense that the film is holding in place instead of moving ahead. Some viewers experience this as a slowdown, a dip in energy, a loss of urgency, especially when the tension isn't escalating as quickly as expected. Others, though, see it differently. They read those slower moments as deliberate, as breathing space, as the film allowing its characters to settle, to evolve, to build towards something bigger. And when you're invested in that dynamic, those moments don't feel like a slowdown. They feel like build-up. So again, it comes down to connection. If you're locked into the characters, if the tension is working for you, the film feels lean, controlled, even efficient. But if that connection isn't fully there, those same scenes start to feel extended. The film begins to feel longer than it actually is, and that's where the perception of runtime shifts. Then we reach the final stretch, and this is where the film tries to regain or reinforce its momentum. The intensity increases, the conflict sharpens, the pacing tightens again. For some, this late escalation justifies everything that came before. It gives purpose to the slower sections, it brings the film back into focus. But for others, it's not quite enough to fully recover that earlier loss of momentum. The earlier dips still linger, and while the ending delivers on intensity, it doesn't completely erase the feeling of uneven pacing. And that's the balancing act the film navigates. Because when you build a story around escalation, every moment has to contribute to that climb. If the progression stalls, even briefly, the impact of what comes next changes. Still, it's worth noting that the film never fully loses its grip. It never becomes disengaging. It just fluctuates. And those fluctuations are what define how the runtime feels. Not too long, but not always as tight as it could have been. And in a film this focused, that difference matters. There's a question that follows. Send help from the very beginning. Does it feel new? Or does it feel like something you've seen before? Because the truth is, it's both. On one hand, the setup is instantly recognizable. Two people stranded on an island. A survival situation that turns into something more personal. A power dynamic that shifts as circumstances change. These are familiar ingredients. You've seen stories like this. You understand the framework. You can almost anticipate the kind of journey it might take. And the film doesn't hide that. In fact, it leans into it. You can feel echoes of other stories in the DNA of this one. Survival dramas, psychological duels, relationship breakdowns under pressure. The structure isn't reinvented. The foundation is known. But then, the film starts to reshape that foundation. Because what makes Send Help stand out isn't what it's doing, it's how it's doing it. It takes those familiar elements and layers them. Survival isn't just physical, it's psychological. Conflict isn't just situational, it's rooted in a corporate past. The island isn't just a setting, it's an extension of a broken system. And suddenly, something that felt recognizable starts to feel slightly off, in a good way. Because the film doesn't just follow the formula, it complicates it, it blends tones, it shifts perspectives. It pushes its characters into uncomfortable territory. And that creates a version of the story that feels different, even if the pieces themselves aren't entirely new. But at the same time, that familiarity never fully disappears. There are moments where you can clearly see the influences, where the trajectory feels expected, where certain beats land in ways you've anticipated. And for some viewers, that limits the impact, because no matter how well something is executed, if it feels too close to what you've seen before, it's harder for it to feel truly original. So the film ends up existing in this middle space. Not completely fresh, but not generic either. It's a remix. A reconfiguration of known ideas into something that feels just different enough to stand out, especially within the context of modern studio films. And whether that works for you depends on what you're looking for. If you're expecting something entirely new, something that breaks the mold completely, you might find it familiar. But if you're open to a film that takes established ideas and reshapes them with a distinct tone, strong performances, and a more unconventional edge, then it feels unique. Not because it reinvents the genre, but because it approaches it from a different angle. And sometimes, that's enough. Because originality doesn't always come from creating something entirely new. Sometimes, it comes from taking something familiar and making it feel unfamiliar again. Before the island, before the survival, before everything is stripped down to just two people, there's a world, a structured, familiar corporate world. And while Send Help doesn't spend most of its time there, that world matters more than it first appears, because it's where everything begins. The office isn't just a setting, it's a system built on hierarchy, perception, favoritism, and quiet dismissal. And it's within that system that we're introduced to the supporting cast. They're not deeply explored, they're not given long arcs or complex development. But that's not their purpose. Their role is to define the environment, to show you exactly what Linda is navigating. You see colleagues who mock her, who dismiss her, who treat her like background noise. You see how easily she's overlooked, not because she lacks ability, but because she doesn't fit the mold. Then there are the figures closer to power, the ones who orbit Bradley, the enablers, the beneficiaries of favoritism. the people who reinforce the system without questioning it. They align themselves with authority. They support the right decisions. They move with the current, not against it. And through them, you understand Bradley better. Because he doesn't exist in isolation. He exists because of this environment. He's supported by it, reinforced by it, validated by it. Then there are the smaller roles, the ones that don't stay long but still serve a purpose, a voice of reason here, a moment of acknowledgement there, just enough to show that Linda's ability is recognized, even if it's not rewarded. And that contrast matters, because it reinforces the central frustration, that she's not invisible because she lacks value, she's invisible because the system chooses not to see her. And then all of that disappears. The moment the film leaves that world behind, the supporting characters vanish. No check-ins, no cutaways, no external perspective. And that's intentional, because once we understand the system, we don't need to return to it. Its influence lingers, in the characters, in their behavior, in the dynamic they carry onto the island. The workplace doesn't follow them physically, but it stays with them psychologically, and that's what makes the pre-island world effective. It's not there to be expanded, it's there to set the stage, to establish the imbalance, to define the relationships, to give context to everything that follows. Because without that foundation, the power shift on the island wouldn't mean as much, it wouldn't feel as earned, it wouldn't carry the same weight. So while the supporting characters don't dominate the film, they don't need to. They do exactly what they're meant to do. They build the system so the film can break it. Endings are where films prove themselves. You can build tension, you can create atmosphere, you can deliver strong performances. But if the ending doesn't land, everything before it starts to feel incomplete. And Send Help knows that. Because everything it does, the slow build, the shifting power, the psychological tension, all of it is leading somewhere. All of it is building toward a final moment, a release, a payoff. And when that moment comes, the film makes a choice. It doesn't go for something clean, it doesn't go for something simple, and it definitely doesn't go for something comfortable. Instead, it leans into ambiguity, into discomfort, into consequences that aren't easily resolved. And for some viewers, that works, because it feels consistent with everything that came before. This is a story built on moral instability, on characters who don't fit into clear roles. So an ending that refuses to give you a clear resolution feels appropriate, even bold. It leaves you thinking, questioning, replaying what you just saw, not just what happened, but what it means. There's a certain strength in that, in walking away without everything clearly defined, in sitting with the uncertainty. But then there's the other side. Because when you spend an entire film building tension, especially this kind of tension, there's an expectation. You're waiting for something that lands, something that feels like a culmination of everything that came before. And for some viewers, that moment doesn't quite arrive, not in the way they hoped. The ending can feel like it stops just short of a full impact, like it builds and then pulls back, or shifts in a direction that feels slightly different from what was expected. There's also the question of timing. Certain reveals come earlier in the film, which means that by the time you reach the final act, some of the surprise has already been absorbed. And without that element, the ending relies more on execution than revelation, and that's where it becomes divisive. Because depending on how you connect with the characters, depending on how invested you are in their outcome, the final moments either feel unpredictable and satisfying, or restrained and underwhelming. And then there's the emotional payoff. Because this film doesn't give you a clear hero. It doesn't guide you toward a specific emotional conclusion. So when it ends, there's no easy release, no clear sense of victory, no definitive resolution, just the aftermath. And that can be powerful, but it can also feel incomplete. Because without that emotional anchor, the impact becomes more subtle, more internal, more dependent on how you interpret everything that led up to it. Still, even with those divisions, the ending does something important. It stays true to the film. It doesn't compromise its tone. It doesn't simplify its characters. It follows through on the ambiguity, on the discomfort, on the lack of clear answers. And whether that works for you or not, it leaves a mark. Because you don't just walk away thinking about what happened, you walk away thinking about why it happened. And in a film built on shifting power, blurred morality, and psychological tension, that might be the most fitting ending it could have.